Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. Thank you for not attending one of the two film festivals going on this evening and for instead joining us. My name is Jason Marchiafava. I'm Vice President of St. Louis Park Friends of the Arts. We have a really exciting agenda for you this evening. We have a number of organizations present with us tonight or represented tonight. We have Minnesota Citizens for the Arts. Sheila Smith is going to speak to us about a report that was recently released covering the economic impact of the arts in St. Louis Park and across the state and the nation. We have Ann Mavity joining us. She'll share a few remarks. She's a member of our St. Louis Park City Council. Stasha Goodman is a working artist from St. Louis Park. She'll also share some remarks. Kevin Locke is Community Development Director with St. Louis Park as well. Greg Nielsen is representing Metropolitan Regional Arts Council, MRAC. He'll also share some remarks as well. And before we get started, I wanted to share a few remarks as well. Personally, I'm really excited about this report and what it represents for both St. Louis Park and for the state of Minnesota. As someone who does not have a day job in the arts anymore, I speak a different language than people that are immersed in the arts. And this report is much more in line with what I use on a daily basis to communicate the benefit of something to my stakeholders that I work with. And for those of us that, or for members of our society that are not here tonight and that don't intuitively feel or see the benefit of the arts, this kind of report is extremely powerful evidence of what the arts can do for a local community. It's something that we don't, within the arts, spend a lot of time talking about because we intuitively feel it and we see it as we're engaged in it. But for those that don't have regular opportunities to participate in the arts, either as an audience member or as someone that is actively working in the arts, they don't see or feel that same impact on a daily basis. And they may not understand why the arts needs to be a priority along with everything else we do in a community the size of St. Louis Park. So I was really excited that we were able to participate in a report like this. We owe a huge debt to the city of St. Louis Park, not only for alerting us to this study, funding our participation in this study, but also being our champion over the last however many years. They've really stood by us. They've seen the value in our organization and what we're doing across St. Louis Park, and they've really believed in us and our audience members and stakeholders. So thank you to the city, Mayor Jeff Jacobs, obviously, Tom Harmoning, City Manager, Cindy Walsh, Operations and Recreation Director. I'll introduce Sheila in a second here. We wanted to start, since this is an arts organization, we wanted to start with a little piece of art for those of you in the audience that want to see something more than just a formal report presented. So I'm going to invite Diane Pecoraro, our community poet and a member of the St. Louis Park Friends of the Arts Board, to share a quick poem, and then we'll get started with the formal presentation.
I always think that when I leave the world that I'd like to have three things in my tomb, you know, like the Egyptians do. One of them is my iPhone, one of them is Post-it notes, and the third thing would be my Indiglo alarm clock by Timex. So the poem that earned me the reward of being the community poet is actually on this iPhone, and it's called To My Indiglo Alarm Clock. Some might call you insufferable, curse your endless emanation of green light, a chronicle of passing minutes, each one gone, well, in a minute, as it were. You transform dreams into data. How long did that one last? The insane one about tantric sex and the problem of snow removal. Each day's dilemmas merged into shadow stories with no end and no beginning. That one ran from 134 to 217, increments of 5 not being necessary here to tidy up the facts, of which there are few in dreams anyway. Or take the actual, the nocturnal trip to the bathroom, a Frankenstein-like totter in the dark, arms stretched out to feel the way across dark passages, 413 to 419 to be exact, with a stop to peer out the window at the shadowy street and shudder in the night air, cold, cold, when the furnace is at rest. You shout out the time. Not much more to be said about that. It is your job to rouse the stubborn. Consciousness is what you offer the somnolent for the short duration of a luminous readout. At 4:35, you remind us we are here.
Thank you, Diane. Okay, now we'll start our formal presentation. I'd like to welcome to the unusually tall lectern Sheila Smith. Sheila is Executive Director with Minnesota Citizens for the Arts and Chair for Creative Minnesota. She has been our coordinator for our participation in this study. She's given a presentation like this a number of times. I believe I've read somewhere like 80 different presentations so far. So she's traveling all over the state sharing the results of this kind of survey for all of the different communities that participated in the survey this year. So without further ado, I guess Sheila, you want to come up? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, luckily I'm unusually tall, so this is totally going to work out for us. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's fun to be in the same city twice in just the matter of a week or so. And you had a great crowd at the last one at the city council meeting, and now you have another great crowd. I'm very impressed, so thank you for coming tonight. I've worked for Minnesota Citizens for the Arts for 20 years next January, and this is our, I know, seriously, I'm kind of amazed myself. And this is the second round of research about Minnesota's nonprofit arts and culture sector that we have done. The last round was back in 2007. And we find this work to be super important because we need to talk to elected officials, government officials all the time, and they don't always speak our language as arts people. You need to figure out how to speak their language. And I have found that there's nothing as powerful and useful as the economic impact studies in talking to folks who really don't get the arts otherwise. That's why we do this. You know, we don't like to talk about the arts in terms of its economic impact. That's not why anybody in this room does the arts, unless you're making a living as an artist, of course. Because it's a way to get into the mind of somebody who might not want to hear about it otherwise, to think about, oh yeah, there is a lot going on in town, and oh yeah, those folks are really bringing a lot of people here to spend money in local restaurants, among other things. So it's just been very useful. So keep that in mind as we plow our way through this big pile of data. And usually what I'll do is just go through the whole thing, and then we'll open the floor for questions, if that's okay. First of all, Minnesota Citizens for the Arts has been around for 40 years. We were founded back in the 70s by a group of folks who were seeing the legislature get ready to fund a new for-profit sports stadium, and who thought that the world should be more balanced by supporting both professional sports and nonprofit arts and culture things. And even back then, they saw the power of lots of different kinds of people working together. And right away, it was a coalition between arts organizations in the Twin Cities and arts advocates in every corner of the state, in every little rural town in Minnesota. And this model of everybody working together for one purpose at the legislature turned out to be very powerful. And by 2008, we passed a statewide constitutional amendment with our friends in the conservation community that created 25 years of dedicated funding for the nonprofit arts and culture and for the outdoors, called the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. Yay! So that amendment was the first time in the whole nation that arts had been put into a state constitution, let alone dedicated funding for the arts. And we are now leading the nation in terms of public funding for the arts. And you can see the kind of renaissance in every corner of the state that this new funding has caused. There is something going on everywhere. It's great and it's amazing. And the more there is, the more people hunger for it, is what I'm seeing. So let's get into the fun part here. So Creative Minnesota is a project that took about 3 years to get together. It started when in conversations with the state's major funding institutions like McKnight, Jerome, Target, the big foundations, the State Arts Board and Regional Arts Councils, about how there was an utter lack of really good data about the nonprofit arts and culture in Minnesota. If you're in the construction industry, you're going to know how many buildings are being built, how many electricians do we have, what's the economic impact of the construction industry. Those guys will have that right at hand if they're talking to elected officials, but we just didn't have any good data. And so that makes it hard to do good policy by any of these funders, or even see if the legacy dollars are having an impact over time. So the foundations work together to bring Minnesota into the Cultural Data Project, which is an online system where nonprofit arts organization administrators have to spend like a day or two typing in stuff. It's like TurboTax. It's pretty terrible. Who in the room has had to do that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's pretty terrible. However, it's getting shorter all the time, and in fact, I was on a conference call today where I saw the new iteration, which is going to be yet again simpler. So they're making it better all the time. The good thing, and thank you to all of you for doing that work, it made what we're doing today possible. Because one of its side effects was a really healthy and deep set of data that we could draw on to look at the economic status of nonprofit arts organizations across the state. So here you see the list of participating organizations that are the main funders of the project. I want to call out especially the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council and Greg Nielsen here, who's in the crowd, who has served on that committee month after month after month, talking about data with me, and I really appreciate it. So as I said, the main goal is to fill the void and give everybody good data for policy making. We're also creating a long-term plan for data about Minnesota's nonprofit arts and culture sector, in that every 2 years we're hoping to update the nonprofit data and then look at another part of the sector. In 2017, we're hoping to come out with a new study that updates these numbers for the state and the regions, and then also look at the economic lives of individual artists in terms of their contributions to the economy, both as small business people, but also employers and purchasing supplies in Minnesota, and all the economic interactions that artists are having with the economy. And the good news is that all 29 studies done to date are available for free for download at creativemn.org, as are the press releases and the summaries and all kinds of other interesting data about the nonprofit arts. So if you leave here with nothing else in your mind, leave with creativemn.org, because that's where the fun is going to happen. All right, so this study is just about Minnesota's nonprofits, nonprofit arts and culture organizations, and then the spending of their audiences when they go to or home from an arts event. We found 1,269 nonprofit arts and culture organizations in Minnesota statewide, and I was really surprised to see that nearly 68% of the organizations have annual budgets of under $100,000 a year. And the regional arts councils, of course, are very familiar with that, because that's generally the size of organizations that they serve. These are going to, very often are going to be all volunteer groups that get together once a year for a project, or brand new things where kids are graduating from college, they're starting out their new theater company. To me, it's the R&D sector of the nonprofit arts and culture. It's where all the new stuff is happening, and all those organizations who have budgets larger than that once began as some all-volunteer community effort that grew over time and gained traction. So the fact that we have so much going on at under $100,000 a year, I think, is great. We have a wonderfully fermenting nonprofit arts and culture sector, and a bunch of those things that are going to take hold and grow larger. Then in terms of participating organizations, the largest number of organizations are in the performing arts. That's community theaters, community orchestras, community choir groups, you name it. And then the next largest group is visual arts and literary arts and all those other types of art forms. And then beyond the arts, the next largest group is historical societies. With all 87 Minnesota counties having a historical society, it makes sense that there'd be lots and lots of historical society. So here's the big number. The total economic impact of the nonprofit arts and culture sector is $1.2 billion. Wow. Woo! Yeah. Which is way bigger than I thought it was going to be this round. The last time we looked at the nonprofit economic impact in Minnesota, it was $838 million annually. So that's a huge leap from the last time we looked at it. This includes about $700 million of the direct expenditures of the organizations, that is just taking all the budgets of all the nonprofit arts organizations in Minnesota, adding them up, what are they spending? $700 million a year. And then the other number is $500 million, and that is an approximation of what audiences are spending on the way to and on their way home from every arts event they attend, not including the cost of the ticket, which is in the first number. Okay, so it's just what are they spending outside of the arts nonprofit. $1.2 billion is double the arts economy of Wisconsin. Double. Yeah. Even though Minnesota and Wisconsin have basically the same population. We were doing better than Wisconsin before the Legacy Amendment happened, but once the Legacy Amendment happened, it put rocket fuel in our arts economy. We have 10.5 times the arts economy of Kansas. We have 12.5 times the arts economy of South Dakota. If you are a young, creative, beautiful human being in the Midwest, you are loading your crap in your car and you are driving to Minnesota because this is where the jobs are. So $1.2 billion is a 43% increase since the last study in 2006. So what happened between 2006 and now? The Legacy Amendment, of course. But we also had the Great Recession. And as I looked around the country at what happened in other states during the Great Recession, you could see a real dip in attendance and revenues for the nonprofit organizations. And a lot of them are still suffering. But if you looked at Minnesota's arts economy, we had a dip in attendance and revenue, but we didn't go as far down, and we didn't lose as many organizations as other states did. Those organizations that were too fragile to make it through in other states, they just went away, and we lost very few in that trough. The $1.2 billion supports over 33,000 jobs in the state. 33,000 jobs is both the people who work for nonprofit arts and culture organizations. So everybody in the audience who makes their living in part by being paid by a nonprofit arts and culture organization, please raise your hand. There you go. We have a sprinkling. Anna, seriously. You're hurting my numbers. Okay. Then the rest of the jobs are that first wave of jobs that are created by the spending of the organizations. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that got printed today for this event. A printer was paid to print that, so some small portion of that printer's workforce is paid for by the activity that's happening right here. There's a little bit of catering over there. Is it Starbucks? I can't see that far. Caribou Coffee. Okay, so a piece of the barista's salary is being paid for by you guys tonight at this arts event, and that's just a couple of examples. The study doesn't use multipliers. Like you hear in the news, economic impact study comes out from one thing or another that wants to justify one thing or another, and they say, yeah, it's got a multiplier of 11 times. 11 times we took this $1 and ran it through the economy. Well, this study is much more conservative in how it looks at the numbers, because we just wanted to know the numbers. Those of you who participated in the Cultural Data Project are the only ones who contributed to this factoid. About a third of our data set came from the Cultural Data Project. Another third was grantee information from the State Arts Board, Regional Arts Councils, and Minnesota Historical Society. And then the final third was an online survey of about 10 questions that we went after the organizations that weren't in those systems, such as the science museums and children's museums and such. These are just the CDP organizations. I think it's a massive undercount of the number of volunteers and volunteer hours. Nonetheless, it's over 62,000 people are volunteers, and nearly 3 million volunteer hours. It's amazing. For every dollar of state investment, if we just look at the budgets of the organizations in the CDP, for which we had lots and lots of data, we could look at what are the percentage of their budget supported by. Basically, of every $6 in a nonprofit organization's budget, $1 is coming from the state. And I like to point out the orange circle, which is just over $2 coming from contributions from individuals, foundations, and businesses. When the Legacy Amendment passed, people said, oh, we don't have to give money to the nonprofit arts and culture anymore. It's all going to be supported by that Legacy Amendment, yada, yada, yada. Well, obviously that's not true when a third of the organization's budget is supported by contributions, more than a third in earned income, and then just 1 out of every $6 from the state. So it's important that people do contribute to nonprofit arts and culture organizations, both with their time and their resources. 19 million attendees in Minnesota are served annually by the nonprofit arts and culture organizations. We have about 5.5 million people living in Minnesota. So on average, each Minnesotan is going to the arts about 4 times. That includes the people, though, that are coming from out of the state, so we can't actually say that's, perfect average. But that gives you a sense of the scope of the audience number size. This, too, is a huge growth from 2007. 4.5 million more attendees than 2007. The attendance at arts events in Minnesota are blossoming like crazy. Also, 2.6 million K-12 students are served annually by the nonprofit arts and culture sector. There's only 900,000 kids in Minnesota. So on average, each kid is getting 3 experiences at nonprofit arts and culture organizations, whether they're taking a bus to go to a historical society, or if these kids are at the Children's Theater in Minneapolis, coming from North Mankato, and that's going on every day all over the state. And if you go down in St. Paul and Minneapolis in front of any of those major institutions, there's buses lined up around the block from kids that are coming over during their school day. In addition to those K-12 kids, we have nearly 25,000 student group visits and 766,000 classes, workshops, and readings. And I think this is important because people think, oh, when you hit 18, you no longer care about the arts. It's a kid's thing. Well, hell no. Nonprofit arts and culture organizations are serving adults, 18 plus, with over 750,000 classes and workshops and readings. That many opportunities on an annual basis for an adult to go out and learn something new is fantastic. And that's a statewide number. And also, it's only from the Cultural Data Project organizations, so I think this is really a massively undercounted category also. So we did surveying of audiences across the state. 3,500 attendees at events were surveyed. And we found that 43% of attendees have annual household incomes of under $60,000 a year. The canard is only rich people care about the arts and only the rich people go to the arts. Well, clearly that's not true. The nonprofit arts and culture sector is serving the whole spectrum of the population. Average attendee spending is about $20.50 per person, and that's good to know. And you also have, on a statewide basis, about 16% of the state's audience is non-local, that is coming from outside the state. So what are these folks spending money on? Say that I, living in Forest Lake, decided I'm going to come to an event here in town. I'll go to one of the film festival events. I hire a babysitter, I get in the car and I drive over here. I get into town and oh, I need gas. I go to the gas station and buy gas. We decide, let's go out to dinner before the film. We do that. The film is amazing. I see friends there. We grab them and say, hey, let's go to a bar and talk about that amazing film, which we do. We have a drink or two. And then the designated driver drives me home and relieve the babysitter. So every step of the way since I left my house, I've had an economic interaction with town, with businesses large and small all over town. And all those little interactions are adding up. For every attendee, $20.50. For, on a statewide basis, 19 million attendees. That's why there's $500 million in economic impact. However, the other person, say Greg, stayed home in his Barco lounger and watched The Voice. Right? He had zero economic interaction with St. Louis Park. He did not visit the gas station or the restaurant or the bar or buy a drink at intermission or anything. So it's great to get people out of their houses, going to nonprofit arts and culture events and spending money all over town. That's exactly what economic development professionals want. That's exactly what elected officials want. That's exactly what makes this kind of data handy when you need to talk to folks who don't understand the intrinsic value of the arts. Here's another beautiful statistic. Non-local attendees spend 80% more than local attendees. On a statewide basis, this is because in a lot of places, people coming in for an arts event, like if you're going to Grand Marais to take a class at the Grand Marais Art Colony, you're going to stay overnight in a hotel because it's really far from your house. So you're spending more money in restaurants because it's going to take you longer to get home. Here in St. Louis Park, you might want to think about how do we get people who don't live in St. Louis Park to come to St. Louis Park to go to these events so that they will drop money in your restaurants. I suppose it's also because local attendees might just be eating dinner at home. Okay, we're going to shift gears a bit. Over 42,000 artists live in Minnesota. That's a huge number of artists and also bigger than we thought it was going to be. And this was relatively simple to get. The U.S. Census asked people, what do you do for a living? And over 42,000 people answered artist. That's great. We found another study from the National Endowment for the Arts that showed that Minnesota surpasses the U.S. level of artists in the workforce. And we surpass the national level of employment in performing arts, in theaters, in museums, and fine arts schools. And that really tall bar there, we have 5 times the national level of employment in publishing. We have so many publishing companies in Minnesota. We have the University of Minnesota Press, the Minnesota Historical Society Press, Dragonfly Press, Coffee House Press, Grey Wolf Press, on and on and on. If you Google Minnesota presses, you will find pages and pages and pages of print publishing companies in Minnesota. So it's a great place to be an author. I mean, I think you've seen some of the other statistics that are not included here about the number of writers in Minnesota. A lot of it has to do with the community fostered by the Loft in Minneapolis. Okay, shifting gears down to the regional level, there's 11 arts regions in Minnesota, and you guys are part of the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council area, basically the 7-county metro area. One of these people is Jeff Prower, the executive director of MRAC. No, I'm just kidding. I like this picture because there's 11 actors in it. So we found a great number of arts organizations in every particular region and a robust arts economy in every region of the state. The arts are not a metro thing. They are a statewide thing. I stumble upon people in the metro who think that the metro is the only place there that the arts exist, and it's not true. So just look at this map. There's also substantial arts audiences everywhere in every corner of the state, even like up in Region 1, which is north of Crookston, essentially, where there are very few people. There's a lot of arts events going on. I went up to do this presentation there, and 200 people showed up. And I swear I was driving across the prairie where nobody lived for a really, really long time till I got there. I couldn't believe how many people were there when I got there. Now we're in St. Louis Park. So 15 St. Louis Park organizations participated in this study, and it's everything from the St. Louis Park Recreation, Theater, or St. Louis Park Friends of the Arts, which were our core sponsor, the community band, the public theater, all the film festivals, etc. So lots of different kinds of organizations here. And actually, this is more organizations than in a lot of places that I've been on the tour. Very often, this study would have been done for a city with only 4 or 5 arts organizations, so that's really good. So your 15 organizations essentially follow the same profile as the statewide group of organizations. The performing arts is by far the most popular and common, and then you have arts multipurpose next, and then you have history and preservation as the next group. Your budget size also looks very much like the statewide picture in that the majority, in fact, all but one of your organizations have annual budgets of under $100,000 a year. This data comes from fiscal year 13. So if your organization is not in this list, it's because it didn't yet have its 501c3 status in 2013. That's probably the reason. Other reasons that organizations would not be in this data is that even if they were a grantee of the State Arts Board and Regional Arts Council or Minnesota Historical Society system, if they weren't a grantee in 2013, they probably didn't show up in the data. So the next time we do this, the missing organizations will probably appear. Altogether, these organizations serve over 27,000 attendees annually, which is great, resulting in $1.5 million in economic impact annually in the city of St. Louis Park. So here's where it gets interesting for St. Louis Park. Of the 17 cities and counties that participated in this study, and remember it was opt-in, so it's pretty random. It's not an actual representation of the cities and counties in Minnesota. It's just those that are in it. Roughly, economic impact and economic impact per capita followed the if it's a giant city, those numbers are big. If it's a very small town, those numbers are small. But there were some places that were out of sync with where you would have thought they would have been in the spectrum of 17 cities and counties. And so I'm putting that in here for food for thought. St. Louis Park is 7th in population amongst the 17 cities that were studied. However, you're 14th in economic impact and 14th in economic impact per capita. So you're a bit behind where you would think that you would fall on the spectrum, which tells you there's lots of room for growth, because I think it's human nature to want to experience the arts, and maybe it's a matter of connecting local folks with the opportunities that are existing. So the question might be, how do we better market into the city, all the opportunities that are right here in your neighborhood? And secondly, how do we market outside of the city to get those higher spending folks to come into town and drop money here? So there's two things that the city itself could focus micro-granting on, various marketing efforts both ways. So here's just another way to look at it. The top 7 cities by population, of course, start with Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then work their way down. And the top 7 cities by economic impact are roughly the same except for 2 weird exceptions. Grand Rapids was one of the smallest places we studied, and they were 5th in total economic impact. And it turns out that they're serving really as a hub of arts activities for the Iron Range and northern Minnesota. They have the great Rife Art Center and McCrosty Art Center that are both in performing arts and visual arts, serving as people will drive an hour to participate in things there, even though the people that live on the range say the Grand Rapids is not on the range. And if I said that up there, they'd all get mad at me. That is kind of physically where they're providing services to Virginia and Hibbing and et cetera. And then the other was Cook County. Cook County was one of the tiniest places that we studied, and they are 3rd in the state in terms of per capita economic impact from the arts. There's only a couple thousand people there. So what are they doing that is getting such a huge economic impact? And it's like the story I told before, and I'm one of their arts attendees, so I'll tell you what I did. I signed up for the Plein Air Painting Festival, which is a week-long opportunity to be on the North Shore and paint paintings of the beautiful outdoors. You have to paint them outside, even if it's raining. And it's a week-long thing. You take your canvases up there, they stamp the back so you can prove that you painted them that week, and then you run around town all week and into the woods all week painting paintings, and then at the end of the week you get to display what your work was accomplished that week at the Johnson Heritage Post Gallery. So I, along with 70 other people, are staying in hotels and eating in restaurants 3 times a day and shopping at the Sievertson Gallery and the Birch Bark Gallery all week long, and the Ben Franklin. They figured out a model that gets people to go up there just specifically for an arts community and then stay in town in the hotels and keep spending money for long hunks of time. So that's the Grand Marais Art Colony. There's also the North House Folk School, which is doing exactly the same thing. 3-day classes, 4-day classes, week-long, 2-week-long. So people are dropping a lot of money up there, particularly on hotels. But I don't think that's a model that's necessarily impossible to do for St. Louis Park. You have organizations that provide educational opportunities. Is there some way to package things together that take a longer time so people will stay in town over time and do that kind of thing? You know, I don't know what it would be that you guys might do, but I don't think it's impossible to come up with some coordinated activities that might give you guys opportunities to keep people in town longer and doing more. So the organizations that we listed support together about 40 jobs. So that would be the few of you who raised your hands in the room, plus folks supported at the printers and the grocery store, etc. What's great about St. Louis Park is that your per person audience spending is higher than a lot of other places in the state at over $27 per person. And right now, just about 14% of your audience is non-local. Non-local means not from the 7-county metro area. So it's not just that they're from Minneapolis, it's like they're from Wisconsin, or they're from St. Cloud, or they're from Duluth. So they're coming quite a distance. And just like the statewide number, the largest portion of the attendee spending is for meals before and after, with the second largest here being for souvenirs, which is unusual compared to other places, and I'm not sure what was surveyed, which events were surveyed in the Twin Cities that would have given us that number. But mostly it's meals before and after. We have just skipped a stone across the surface of the data available to you at creativemn.org. Lots of food for thought. Do you have any questions about what you saw? How do you measure economic impact? Okay, so there were 15 organizations in St. Louis Park. So I got together the data that was available about St. Louis Park organizations from the Cultural Data Project, from grantee information of the State Arts Board and Regional Arts Councils, and grantee information from the Minnesota Historical Society. We added together all the budgets of the nonprofits in town. So that is the direct spending of the organizations. Then we added up all the attendees reported by each organization to get a total attendance number. Then there's audience surveying done to figure out, on average, how much is each attendee spending, not including the cost of the ticket, because the ticket cost is included in the first number. And then just do a simple multiplier to figure out your total audience spending number. Then you add those two together, and you get the economic impact number. There's a little bit more complicated stuff underneath there, and if you're interested in methodology, you can download a very detailed explanation of how all this is done on the Americans for the Arts website, which was our partner in doing the math.
And so I wonder if there's any way to capture that information about personal spending for like house parties or events, because I don't think obviously that's not part of the CDP, but is that anything that's being captured? Because that's significant too.
3.5 audience members were surveyed across the state. The survey has to be brief or people won't do it. And so it asked very basic questions. Did you buy gas? Did you go to restaurants? Did you buy souvenirs? Did you stay overnight? Whatever it is. The categories that we found over time tend to be the most common to prompt people to put down some dollars. If you just ask people, what have you spent to get here or go home, they might just put down their bus fare. So the questionnaire lays out a few categories to draw the numbers out of them. But what did you spend to eat at home is not on there.
So basically the numbers are probably higher than what's being reported.
Well, there's a million ways the numbers could have been higher. But I think what's great about this study is that we just count what we can count. So we can really rely on these numbers, unlike those other studies that you've seen where they use, multipliers of 11 times of whatever mysterious formula that they're coming up with. I'm very confident in these numbers being the baseline and true.
Thanks.
I think you were raising your hand there.
Is there any correlation between the suburbs that have significant arts centers like Hopkins and Bloomington and greater economic impact?
Neither Bloomington nor Hopkins participated this time, so I don't know that. However, the White Bear Center for the Arts did, and we started out doing a study of White Bear, then they decided to do just White Bear Center for the Arts. And their results were really interesting because just themselves, as an organization, had a higher economic impact and a higher economic impact per capita on their town than other cities did that were suburban. So there was clearly some magic going on with the Arts Center model, but I didn't have enough data to say, definitively X, Y, Z happens. Mm-hmm. It would be nice to know.
We're working on with the city on a community that's going to be under construction next year. It's a sustainable community for the arts.
Oh.
And it will be about $100 million, so let's make sure we get that counted, Sheila.
What is a sustainable community for the arts?
Means we've got live-in workspace for artists and creatives. We've got cultural institutions there, public art, things like that.
What's it called?
It doesn't have a name yet, but we're called Place.
Are you working with ArtSpace or that kind of arts developer? Is this something independent?
That's where I got my training. I worked for 13 years.
Oh,
for ArtSpace.
Okay. Good. Well, that's great news. I'm sure that'll have a huge impact. Lady in the blue hat.
Thank you, Sheila, for doing this and for going out into the field and coming back and telling us what you're seeing in the community so that we can start doing the same thing here. When you were talking about Grand Rapids, I live here and my studio is 40 miles from there. I'm involved in the community. but do see something there that I think would be helpful to St. Louis Park. And looking at these and what you've done and sort of picking apart and saying, who made the top 5? Why are they there? But we've got up there, KAXE is a radio station.
Yeah.
That 75% of that, if that radio station was out of the elixir, they wouldn't be in the top 5% or the top 5. But they create programs where they've got radio, the across the Art Center, Barb is coming in and talking, and all of them have a place within that station, and they have set it up. It's so much fun that if you aren't involved, you just feel like odd man out. So that could be something you could be looking at, is different ways to, using the radio is just an amazingly effective tool.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, any more, or should we hear from our other speakers? Last chance. Okay.
Thank you, Sheila. Next up, we're going to have Ann Mavity join us. She is a member of our St. Louis Park City Council, representing Ward 2. She's a native of the Twin Cities. She's dedicated a lot of her personal and professional life to empowering people to have a voice within their own community. So thank you, Ann.
I was responding and thinking about what you said about having a language that for policymakers, when they think about, and of course I'm thinking, what is that language? Because in many ways, our community, I think this is really helpful and important information for many communities to try to move that ball forward. But I'm so proud of our community that we are so far ahead of the game. And so in some ways, it was back in 2005, 2006, I think, when we were doing Vision St. Louis Park, and arts and culture rose up as one of the city's key priorities. And I don't know, were there folks in this room that participated in that during the time? Bob, some other folks back there. So in many ways, the city, which has been the way we work anyway, but has really followed what the residents have been asking and wanting to express, which is that artistic piece as part of our, sort of a core part of our community. So with Friends of the Arts, I think we've had this amazing partnership with the city and Friends of the Arts. So in taking this as a priority for the city, it means supporting this organization, Friends of the Arts, and also threading this arts through all the work that we do as a city. So when we're looking at development and developers are coming in, we're telling them, great, and you need to put art integrated into your development. And so we see some of those. One of my more recent favorites is at 36 Park, where they have the leaves. If you've seen them, that are sort of, I don't know if they're glass or something in between, that are outside, sort of our Arts Avenue with the benches that have these cement people that are lounging that you get to sit on. So that kind of integrated art, I think, has become a bit of a trademark for what our community has done. So the other thing about the language, I want to say that I'm all about getting this return on investment, and I think, Margaret, you're right that this touches the surface of what is actually reflecting in terms of our economic investment. But then, how many of you were at the Dylan Tribute Band concert this year? Anyone out there? I think there was 1,000 people at Wolf Park in the amphitheater, and yes, there's a measurement about who went to McCoy's and had a drink and dinner ahead of time, but the joy and the community in that space while the tribute band was playing, to me, is also a value. It might be qualitative and not quantitative, but I think it is absolutely critical to what makes our community such an amazing place. So I think it's both and as part of this. I know for me, maybe in this room we probably have a higher percentage of true artists than folks like me who I've never thought of myself as an artist at all. Even though it was, I think, in high school when Walt Whitman sort of blew my mind open to a whole nother world out there. And sort of as I've gone through the world, I think, well, yeah, I'm in the community orchestra playing my viola, and I do a mosaic, platter here and there, or just walk around and recite poetry because it's fun. but I'm not an artist, right? But so many of us are. And so when we have our community poet who is bringing people together and sort of bringing out these components of all of regular people like me who aren't really artists but love this stuff, to me, again, that's part of what the joy is in this community. So I'll just leave this with saying, this is also about investing in the future and for the next generations. And I love the way that our community has really spread this through generations. So there was some economic impact in my household when my daughter, who is a senior in high school, last summer came down and said, "Do we have permanent magic markers?" And I'm like, "Yes, they're in the drawer on the left." Then about a week and a half later, I walk into her bedroom and see on the wall, everywhere, 3 walls covered with poetry, every which way, in permanent black magic markers. So we are having our impact in my household as well. So anyhow, thank you.
Next up, I'd like to welcome Stasha Goodman to the podium. Stasha is a self-taught and evolving artist. I'm going to read this so I get it right. Whose passion is creating large-scale public and private art. Her style leans towards contemporary abstract patterns, playful representational, and calming Zen organic. She was the recipient of a St. Louis Park Arts and Culture grant in 2010, which she used to create the colorful and playful mural outside the entrance to this building, actually. So, Stasha, if you want to come up and say a few words.
It's great having a visual artist follow like professional speakers. I want to thank Susan Schneck for inviting me to come and talk to you tonight. Yes, I did create the piece when you walked into the building tonight. I have a particular passion for upcycling trash into my work. And by the way, that piece is going to be looking for a new home in about a year. So if you have any thoughts of where it might land, let me know after. So I'm going to say just a few words about how the data that was presented affects an artist like me. And granted, I'm not one of the organizations that was studied. I'm just a little old me, visual artist. But 2 words come to mind, validation and opportunity. As an artist, I do what I do because I really believe that art can have a profound impact on people, whether it's customers, users, patients, citizens, employees, but that's the soft data. And what really talks is economic data. And having metrics like this validate communities or a business or hospital or schools' investment and commitment to the arts. And this validation is what leads to more opportunities for artists like me to share their work, and more so to get paid a livable wage to do so, so that I'm happy to say that rather than working 3 jobs, I am now cutting down to 2, so that's great progress. So I just want to share a few anecdotes, because you've had a lot of data tonight, about how some of my work has had an economic impact. So I'm just going to throw out 4 different projects that I've done or I'm about to do, and how I've seen them have a really strong impact. Kenwood Elementary School has a soaring 2-story atrium mural that I did a few years ago. And the motto for that school is Arts Plus Smarts. And that mural is right when you walk in the door. And the school is using that mural to recruit new families and staff and have that be visual evidence that they're walking the talk of their commitment to the arts. Just within the last few weeks, I completed a large mural in Calhoun Square. The owner of Calhoun Square wanted to create a community bulletin board on a massive wall, just said, do a bulletin board, okay? So it has a cork board in it, and it has a big mosaic mural around it. And he's using it as a way to help market tenants within there. They can put up notices on that bulletin board. It encourages people to linger, to scan what's on there, grab a cup of coffee at Dogwood Coffee, grab a sandwich at Jimmy John's, do some shopping. And I can say that when my husband and I were installing that over the course of 2 weeks on scaffolding, the number of people who walked by and would say, "Oh, cool," or in some cases, "That's effing cool," because we're in Uptown, and would take pictures of it to post on social media sites. And I can say when you're in Uptown in Calhoun Square, having the cool factor is a really important marketing point for the tenants as well as the people going through that building. This last spring, I completed a major focal point piece of art for the main entrance of the newly remodeled St. Paul Children's Hospital. And within 2 weeks, I got an email from a physician who was working there to thank me for putting that piece of art up, or having been commissioned to put that piece of art up, because as an employee, it's showing that her employer is investing in the beauty of the space and the commitment to making the working environment pleasant and lovely, and when you're not dealing with such pleasant and lovely things all the time. So a lot of times, it's not just for the customers or the users, but it's also for the employees who are working there, the vendors who are walking through. And then the last example is kind of what I think of sort of the granddaddy of them all, is what do you think is the number one way that people judge an airport? How they rank the quality of an airport? It's restrooms, believe it or not. That's what the Metropolitan Airports Commission has found out. So they are embarking on a 20 to 30-year plan to remodel and highly upgrade all of their bathrooms. And so what do you think that they're using on those big walls when you walk toward the bathroom and you have to go to the right or to the left? Art. And so they made an investment a few years ago in 2 large mosaic pieces and have had such a phenomenal response that myself and 4 other mosaic and tile artists are now, we've been hired to put very large murals at those restroom entrances. So that's, who knew? I think 10 years ago that probably was not something that they knew. If you're around the newly expanded Terminal 2 next summer, and you have to use the bathroom, look for my 2 walls that will feature a summer scene and a winter scene of the Northern Lights. So be fun. And then lastly, I just want to say, and this was mentioned in the data as well, is that I'm really an example of, when you pay artists well within your community, we truly want to give back to the people who have invested in us. And, I'm just one fairly small but growing rapidly visual artist, and in the past month, I know that I've spent a minimum of $3,000 among 5 different businesses in St. Louis Park. So thanks for inviting me, and I just want to say, big thanks to St. Louis Park for investing in the arts. If you go to my website, that piece that's downstairs is the first thing you see on my website, and I do feel like it played a big role in helping to launch my career and where I'm at now. So thank you.
Thank you, Stasha. Next up, we're going to have Kevin Locke come up and share a few thoughts. Kevin is the St. Louis Park Community Development Director. He's been in that role for 11 years, and he's spent about 40 years working on economic development and community development. So please join me in welcoming Kevin. Thank you.
On my good days, I think of what we do in community development as practicing the art of building a city and a community, but that's maybe a little bit overblown for what we do. But I did want to thank Friends of the Arts, the organizations, I should say, responsible for the study of the economic impact of the arts, and for the rigor with which it was done, and the fact that it was done in a very straightforward way that you can say with confidence these numbers are meaningful and they are accurate, and if anything, maybe cautious, and so underrepresenting just what the arts mean for the city of St. Louis Park and the state of Minnesota. Community development is kind of the mystery meat of city government. Everyone knows what police does, everybody knows what the public works guys do, what the heck is community development? Well, in St. Louis Park's case, we're responsible for housing, planning and zoning, our economic development, and all these redevelopment projects. And one of the key things to being successful as a community is the constant reinvestment, and we're trying to build community. Arts are really a critical piece to that whole puzzle of creating a great place for people to live and a place that people want to invest. And tonight we have Chris from the Place organization, and they're looking at making a really big investment and one of the most unique projects probably any place in the state once it gets put together. And arts are a central piece of that. And one of the reasons why we support as a city, and our council supports the arts so strongly as a city, is that that brings community, it pulls people together. We're about creating gathering places and reasons to connect with people. I think it was probably 10, 12, maybe 15 years ago, Richard Florida wrote his book about the creative class and talked about cities that had the creative juices, the creative people and organizations at the core of their strength as cities, and that those, because we are in the era of intellectual activity, is really critical to economic growth. If you have a place that has many opportunities for creative outlet and draws other creative people, you will build a strong community. And ultimately, that's all a city is people and their lives. So thank you for what you do. We support and will find very valuable the report that was done on our particular situation. And I enjoyed the suggestion for some economic development strategies too, related to growing that even further in our community. So thank you again, and keep up with the arts.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up, we have Greg Nielsen with the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council. Greg's been with the council since 2001. Prior to MRAC, he worked for Minneapolis Park and Rec, as well as the Eastside Arts Council in St. Paul. Thank you for joining us, Greg.
So whenever somebody from outside Minnesota asks me about the support in the arts, I usually quote the fact that we're #1 in the per capita in the union for public arts contributions. However, I've got a new story now, and that is on a cold Thursday night in late October in Minnesota, when most Minnesotans are beginning their winter hibernation. We had about 30 people show up, not for an arts event in St. Louis Park, but for a presentation on data about the arts. So thank you. This is really wonderful. This is my first of these little arts events or data presentations that I have attended. To avoid the stereotype, though, I think I will leave out the piece about the hockey in the background. I am a program director with the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council. We grant out about $3.2 million of the legacy amendment portion, and also a portion of the general appropriation dedicated every 2 years. But in addition to being a grant maker, and there's a lot of our grantees in the room here today, we also view ourselves as a resource for the region, an arts council in the broader sense, and advocacy is a really key component of what we do. So part of advocacy is telling stories, and we collect stories of the nearly 500 different organizations that seek out grant funding through us every year. And we collect these stories, and as mentioned earlier, these are the personal stories about impact, stories about youth engaging in the arts in an after-school program, or an audience member seeing a theatrical production, etc., or artists working in the arts. But for many years, there was a missing chapter in that book of stories, and that is this piece about the economic impact, the external benefits of the arts. So this is really a report that helps us to better tell the story and better represent the full story of the arts here. I will also like to thank the City of St. Louis Park for funding this localized version. When we began this research, the intention was to do a statewide report, and I know there was also plans for breaking down regional data. But as the process unfolded, we realized that there was an opportunity to do these localized reports, but we weren't sure what that response would be. And 17 now, I think it's really wonderful, and I have my Google alerts up, and there are little press releases constantly coming out from these meetings from local press because I think that they say all politics is local. I think all arts is local. And the reaction to these localized reports has been really wonderful. So thanks for to the City of St. Louis Park and the St. Louis Park Friends of the Arts for supporting this and hosting this event tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So that marks kind of the end of our formal presentation for the evening. So we wanted to open it up to the audience for discussion and any questions that might remain for any of our speakers or anyone from Friends of the Arts as well.
I realize that it would be hard to capture some of the data that I'm going to mention, but it was interesting to me anyway that you mentioned the food at your dinner party after, and I was thinking about all the, when Sheila gave the figure for all of the writers in Minnesota, I think it was 40 some odd thousand.
Well, we have 5 times the level of employment in publishing than the rest of the country.
Yes. So I was thinking of all of us who are not employed as writers, who do volunteer hours or do spending on the side. So I think what I'm suggesting is that there's data that hasn't been captured, and I'm very comfortable with that, but I'm thinking that somewhere there should be or could be a list of things that are not captured and that might be interesting in the future for communities to think about.
I'm wondering if there's any insight into comparing the amount of money that's invested in the arts and what the outcome of that is. Yeah, return on investment. So, like, if there's, $1 from grants and that produces $50 in economic output. That was, I just made up that number.
Well, if you download the full report from creativemn.org, there's a page that looks into the budgets of the organizations in terms of where does their revenue come from. So you could, from looking at that, do the math the other way and come up with some sort of formula. You could do that.
I have a question actually to the FOTA folks, the Friends of the Arts folks, because as you were talking about 15%, not quite 15% of St. Louis Park's economic impact is outside of the 7-county area, if I understand.
15% of the audiences come from outside the 7-county metro area.
And we recently created the Visitor and Tourism Bureau in St. Louis Park, Discover St. Louis Park, and I'd love to hear how we're connected, because I know that at least the former director, he'd be driving all around the state putting brochures about St. Louis Park in Nisswa and Bemidji, all these different places, and a great way to accelerate our audience or expand our audience.
Sure, I can say a few things, especially to the Discover St. Louis Park piece, the Visitors and Convention Bureau. I know that in 2014, when Friends of the Arts did the Our Town Arts and Nature program, they worked very closely and got engaged with Discover St. Louis Park to market that program, and it was a very successful partnership. I will be meeting with them in early November to talk about projects and budgets for 2016. So we're working on that. It is really important, I think, to note that we have a lot of work to do to get outside audiences into St. Louis Park, but a lot of the groundwork that we've been working on the last 15, 20 years is actually cultivating the arts experience in our own town. And our advocacy has really been for arts access and arts activity for our own community members. So this is a really great opportunity for us to have the data to take it to the next level. With that being said, that also brings up the point that Sheila made about so many of our organizations, in fact all but one of them, are very small. Actually, 5 of those organizations are so small that they are not actually legal nonprofits. They fall under the umbrella of Friends of the Arts. So we serve as the fiscal agent for 5 of those organizations. So our organizations are very organic. They're very involved with community members. And in fact, these numbers, again, are from 2013. Most of those organizations were not in the Cultural Data Project in 2013. Their dollars are coming up in these numbers, but for example, their volunteer hours are not. And we have reached out to those organizations and put together numbers where we show at least 100 volunteer hours, 100 volunteers volunteering at least 20 hours a year for each of those organizations in 2013 that are not in here. And each of those hours is counted, I think, at about $22 an hour in impact. So this is really a baseline, really a minimal baseline. And we got a lot of great things to do.
Susan Schneck is going to close us out for the evening. Susan is our founder and champion and forever supporter. And right now she's also our interim executive director, so please welcome Susan Schneck.
I think this is a really exciting time, and as several people have pointed out, to have 30 people come out to talk about data, about the arts. I was pretty concerned today thinking about how excited I was about this and thinking, how many other people are going to get out of bed this morning and think, oh, I'm really excited about going to hear about data for the arts tonight. So this is really exciting. I think that we know this is a baseline. We know we have a lot of good things now that we can do with this data and with arts, talking about quality of life and also talk about economics. I think that one of the things that really struck me this summer when I came back to this organization was that working with a group of board members that were all new board members, each of them expressed their surprise when they stumbled across Friends of the Arts. The reality was that no one expects, as a new resident in a community, no one's out there looking for the arts organization. They don't expect it to be there. So I think our goal now is to have such a presence that people do stumble about it, that they are not surprised, that it's even more part of the fabric of everyday life. So I challenge all of us to bring arts into our lives and follow the trend not only to buy local, but to support local arts and surprise your neighbors by inviting them to local arts and into local arts activities. I think this is really a good direction for us to move in. Thanks again for coming out tonight. Thanks to the city for sponsoring us. Sheila and Minnesota Citizens for the Arts, great collaboration. And now we know again and again we can remind ourselves, as Paul Wellstone said, when we all do better, even the artists. Thanks.